So we are now in the second phase of the morning's program. That is the comments from our roundtable panelists in this section.
My question will be very short. In 1993, this State Secretary Warren Christopher proposed to Germany shared leadership. What do you think about this idea?
I did not know that, but it's very important to understand that the United States does not believe in shared leadership. The United States believes that it should run the world, and that everybody else should dance to its tune. And that includes the West Europeans and the Russians, as Steve and Trina made clear. Fortunately, from an American point of view, the West Europeans do their duty and do what we ask them most of the time. This is especially true of the British. You all understand that the United States has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. And our present war against ISIS is the 7th war that we have fought since 1989. The British have fought all 7 of those wars with us. And even though there were some protests from some European countries regarding the Iraq War in 2003, by and large, the Europeans have gone along with us. And as Steve made clear, and I agree with him completely, the Russians, and Putin in particular, have tried to cooperate with us. But if you don't do everything that we say, we get very angry with you, and you pay a certain price.
I must say that I came to this session deeply depressed, and over the last few months, as the situation was indeed heading for war, and I think possibly the breakup of Ukraine. I must say that the discussion and the comments we've had this morning have cheered me, not for the substance, the content, but the fact that there are people out there, and I know that there's plenty of people who are actually talking this way, and actually, I think, beginning to understand not only the danger in which we live, but also trying to examine the depth of the contradictions, if you like, which has provoked this crisis. And this is a sort of a positive to sense that there's beginning to be a fight back for what has been an absolutely astonishing abnegation, it seems to me, of the media responsibility and indeed of elites of the last, certainly the last year, but I would say much more deeply. And in fact, I would slightly, if I may, push a little bit further and say that I think this crisis, which we're now living through, has been predetermined. I certainly have been warning about it for 5-10 years. It was quite clear that there was no stable, inclusive, post-Cold War European security order. This was the case quite visible under Yeltsin, even more under Putin. It's far deeper than this. And I mean, we constantly look for where it all began. I would say at the very first moment, I would even go so far, obviously this year is the 70th anniversary of the Yalta Conference, but it's also, this is the big moment, from Yalta we then went to Malta. Yalta suggested that the European security order would be pluralistic. You may not like it or not, but you had the Soviet Union, which was finally at Yalta recognized as a great power, as an interlocutor, a country with whom you can do diplomacy. And of course they did during the détente and so on. What happened at Malta, this is December 1989 with George H.W. Bush, that what we saw at the Malta meeting was the repudiation of this. What we saw was what they call a power transition in Malta, where Gorbachev really was saying, look, the Soviet Union no longer wants to fight this Cold War. Let's jointly enjoy the fruits of victory to establish a new type of world order, which is inclusive, but building on a pluralistic order in which, at that moment, in December 1989, Gorbachev was still talking about a humane democratic socialism. In other words, there'd be a pluralism not only of states, but also of social systems. You'd have a socialist system and you'd have a capitalist system. At Malta, this fundamentally was, I mean, clearly a decision. We now know the documents are now coming out. There was no stenographic record at Malta, but we're now seeing what's come out. And it was quite clear that this was not accepted, that Gorbachev was hoping to transcend the logic of Cold War. What the United States did was simply shifted the polarity and said, we are now the winners. It's quite clear that the Soviet Union is kaput, and it's this nonsense about a common European home and a humane democratic socialism. Where's all that coming from, this progressive vision that Gorbachev was trying to articulate? So Malta is the moment where the foundations, and we, in my view, have been arguing all the time, for 25 years, we've lived in a fool's paradise. That none of the major problems of European identity, as well as security, were resolved. We lost at Malta. Who was there? There was no, sorry, I was going to say British leader, no European leader. At Yalta, at least there was Churchill, who spoke for Europe. And of course, if you remember at Yalta, he made every effort to bring France on board, and they got a zone of occupied Germany and so on. At Malta, there was nothing. There was just the United States and the Soviet Union. And this, we've lacked a continental vision. And instead of which, Europe has become subsumed into this Atlanticist alliance. And so, and this third part that we heard, the three elements of it, absolutely essential. This security, hard security, European Union soft security, if you like, and what I call trans-democracy. This mixture of democracy as part of the European, as we're trying to build, democracies, is part of the attempt to achieve a European security order. So it was what we've sought for 25 years, effectively, was what I call a mimetic Cold War, scapegoating all of what René Girard and others would say, externalization of problems onto the other, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, now Putin, in exactly this extraordinary collapse, if you like, of diplomacy. Katrina mentioned diplomacy. You cannot have diplomacy with a monster, so like Hitler and so on. And so this complete collapse means that we've got to a position which is far more dangerous even than I think our panelists have suggested. Yes, on the military side, yes, war is not excluded. We already have it. In the heart of Europe, who could have possibly believed that Europeans would mess up so big time to allow a raging war in the heart of the continent? That it is a moment for reflection, and indeed on the knees to Canossa, it seems to me, is appropriate. So this European dimension, so how do we go from this? How do we get out of it? Is to rebuild a vision of genuine continentalism. And indeed, let's go back even to Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, who's still out there, who's actually, as you know, he went to Berlin just recently, for the Berlin Wall anniversary in November, and he says, I'm going to Berlin to support Putin. So it's interesting that that Gorbachev, one of the most respected senior statesman, but even for that statement, even Gorbachev is now being traduced and insulted and humiliated after all these years, which is very peculiar. So the way forward is a genuine rebirth of the European continental vision. And I don't mean this anti-American way, or not at all. I mean in alliance with progressives, alliance on a continental, an Atlantic alliance, but certainly a vision of Europe taking responsibility. And here we are next door to the European Commission. And they have abnegated. I just had one final point, and that some of you may have seen the House of Lords report, which came out about a week ago, which analysed Russia-EU relations. And they used the term 3 times in the House of Lords report. So it was surprisingly good. Actually said that European Union sleepwalked into this crisis. Sleepwalk. Why did they sleepwalk? Some people have been out there warning for such a they weren't listened to. So I agree with the media, the collapse of media and elite and political class responsibility. Thank you.
My name is Georgi Pirinsky. I come from Bulgaria. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the first time. My question to the very interesting presenters would be this. Ms. Van Hooy, towards the end, said that there might be a window of opportunity opening having to do with this rush to rearm, I believe it was what you were referring to, and this concern, what is this leading us into? What sort of a perspective? Is there any chance that there would be any sort of an occurrence of the type of the long telegram of George Kennan of 1947, which would, if we are on the verge, already in a new Cold War, and on the verge of maybe it getting hot, somebody coming up and saying, now, wait a minute, let us see where we have arrived and what is in the best interest of the United States from here on. Because Yalta was mentioned, and Yalta certainly was diplomacy, and the major, item of contention was Poland, and it moving 200 miles to the west. Today it's Ukraine seemingly presenting this same nexus of conflict. So Could it be, by the way, I don't know whether you followed the broadcasts of the Nemtsov homage being paid, and there was an appearance by Chubais. And Chubais said, now, just let us all stop. Stop. The government, the opposition, the nationalists, the I don't know who's, and let us see where are we going as Russia. Well, the same kind of note should in some way be struck in the United States also, and in Europe, of course. And you mentioned Henry Kissinger, and you mentioned other people, and Gorbachev. Maybe it's opportune to bring all these people together, perhaps in Berlin, and get them very high profile and in a very strong voice say, this is not the way we want to see the world evolving, and there is a much better way, so let's gather our senses and go in that direction.
I would like Steve and or Gil to reply to this, because it does speak to the work you're trying to do with the Committee on East-West Accord. I have a somewhat unconventional view, because I do believe in who will tell the people. I do believe that fundamental change has come from people and movements, and what strikes me is, you must understand, hearing us, and you know that there are other views in the United States other than the elites, this is an elite-driven project in many ways. Survey after survey shows the American people are not as hawkish, to use a crude word, as the elites. But it is ingrained in the psyche as we head into our presidential election that you need to, as President Clinton once said, better to be strong and wrong than weak and right. Why weak? Again, speaking to the demeaning of diplomacy. But I do think there's an opening, because with the doomsday clock, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moving 3 minutes up, with the pushback against sending weapons, with the president, and I have mixed views, I don't share my husband's views exactly on President Obama. I think he has outsourced this policy. I also think that what happens is he's tried to some extent to restrain U.S. involvement in military interventions, but the pressure from a media political elite to go more hawkish, to go more military, we've seen whether it's with ISIS or in Syria. So I think the elite element of this is important, but you need messengers to go out and speak to people and explain to them this is not in the U.S. national security interest or in the world's, and that there are alternatives, because the instinct too often is to drive to war before all other alternatives are exhausted.
So first of all, the answer to Mr. Cohen's question of Poles in east of Ukraine. Last week in the meeting of the Euronest Committee of the European Parliament, we have heard about one poll, a recent poll made by peacekeeping NGO, in just opposite figure, 20% in favor of being in Ukraine, in Donetsk, 56 for sure no, and others not sure answer. I would like to shortly represent myself, just to explain my position. I'm native Russian speaking, and I'm for the third time elected as the European Parliament from the party Latvian Russian Union. So I'm representing Russian speaking minorities mostly, and I have born in the middle of last century, just after the Second World War. And you are here speaking very much on the Cold War, but by my opinion, what is happening now in Europe, in particular in post-Soviet space, is just as an attempt to revenge for the defeat in the real war, in the Second World War. And it is what we are seeing in Baltic states. And we will have in 2 weeks, on 16th of March in Riga, annual march of former SS legionnaires to the very heart of Riga, to Liberty Monument. And we, as anti-fascist movement, we are making counter actions. Today we are in the 10 months after events in Odessa, 2nd of February. And it was also neo-Nazi who initiated these tragic events. In Ukraine also I have visited Kiev on the 2nd of February, and I saw the portrait of Bandera in the very center, and we know that all right-wing politicians who are now having a say here. And my question to our guests from the United States, I am thinking from where it is coming, and you see, in Baltic states we are sacrificed and we are scapegoats of this doctrine of non-acceptance of the United States to not accept the annexation, you-told annexation of Baltic states after the Second World War. Yeah, and it led to legal deprivation of the rights of Russian speakers there, of the rights. 1/3 of residents became stateless, and then my mother, who came from Leningrad after the war, by marrying my father, she passed with this passport of stateless person because she was not a citizen of this pre-war state. And in Ukraine, we have now the same wording of occupation. We hear it in Moldova. We hear it even in Caucasus republics. So that is my father being a submariner, an officer, a Jew and a communist. He liberated Latvia from those who killed whole his Jewish family there. And he was titled as occupier in Baltics. And now all veterans of anti-Hitler coalitions are now blamed and with those who were affiliated with Nazi are saying to be heroes. That's my question to you.
I actually have done all the research for a book on the German killing machine in Eastern Europe between 1939 and 1945. Although I've never written anything on it. And what amazes me, looking at Europe since 1945, is the extent to which the past has been put aside and people have seemed to have moved beyond what happened in Eastern Europe. If you compare the situation in Europe with Asia, it's very different. The South Koreans, the North Koreans, and the Chinese are still furious with Japan for its World War II behavior and the fact that it hasn't apologized in a meaningful way. In Europe, where there was much more killing by the Germans and others than there was by the Japanese and their allies in the East, it has seemed quite remarkable to me the extent to which Europeans have gotten beyond the past. But listening to your comments, what's happening here as another outgrowth of this crisis in the East is that those ghosts are coming back from the grave. And if that is to happen, the amount of trouble that will be caused cannot be underestimated, because the amount of killing and ethnic cleansing that took place in Eastern Europe or Central Europe between 1939 and 1945 was truly staggering.
Okay, excuse me for my English. I am Jean-Luc Schaffhauser. I am member of European Parliament, working in Foreign Affairs Committee. I was involved in the European Forum that made together all the forum against Russia, not Russia in this moment, it was the Bolsheviks. And this was the idea of Gorbachev with continental Europe and with the capacity to be involved in one Europe, but two capacity too. And now I am thinking, can we make such a forum for peace and multilateral world? I think it's very important. Well, in Foreign Affairs Committee, we have only one voice. And this is the US voice. It's very comfortable. But we don't really have, we are not very, what can I say, analysts about the situation, about clever. And we have to think the world as it is, and not as we are only thinking of ideological point of view. And for this, I think if you can be involved such a forum with America, with China, with India, and with member of parliament, I think we have capacity on the right and the left, and in medium also. I was involved also in Parti Populaire Party, and I think of the French side we have much member of parliament who can understand us, and I think with Minsk II was a good. For peace, it was very good. It's like Minsk I, but more in details, and it's very good for peace. I was in Donbass for election also, and I think now we have to make really step by step for peace. And I think the best is to promote this multipolar world and make a forum and say on the world, now is the moment. We have to make a choice. Are we working for the third nuclear world, it will be a nuclear world, or are we working for the peace and the reality of the world today? And this is the most important thing. And I'm sure we can find 200 members of parliament who support this idea. Okay? So we have to do this. We have to do this. Thank you.
First of all, my name is Arif Mamadov. I'm Organization of Islamic Cooperation representative to the European Union. I would like, first of all, to thank all the panelists for very interesting thoughts. But of course, some of us agree with some points, with some we don't agree. And what I disagree the most is that at this moment, pivoting American policy from Europe to Asia, Middle East is the worst possible scenario now. Europe and United States have been in marriage for a long time, and this marriage made so many children to divorce at this stage. And Europe today is too weak, and not before Russia or Russian exaggerated danger, but there is the biggest Cold War which is going on in the Middle East and North Africa. And I understand that both Russia and the West understand that how big challenges this Cold War could be for both Russia and Europe and the Western world. This is where I think that Russia and the Western world can think together, to work together, because this is a real threat and the real challenge for Europe. And at this stage, Americans shifting its policies toward the Asia and the Middle East would be very dangerous. About arming Ukraine, I think that this would be a tragic decision. If anybody would think about that, it would be the biggest mistake, because first of all, arming Ukraine would not make any change for in the benefit of Ukraine. Ukrainian army is completely, it's very weak. It's not because of the arms. It is leadership is terrible. There is no good command. The economic crisis is enormous. At this stage, giving the arms, it is just declaring the war on Russia, and Russia would take it exactly this way. Even decisions to send military advisors, there are some decisions, to send military advisors to Ukraine is itself a big mistake. It is, for Russians, interpreted as we declare war on you. And this is very big danger. West and Russia have many areas where they can work together. American withdrawal from Afghanistan is a thing. Another thing is how to keep stability in this country. We know that Taliban is very powerful, and after complete
pull out of the troops and from advisors, we can have completely new situation there. We have Daesh advancing in the Middle East. It is now advancing in Libya and in other areas. The more Western policies goes against Russia, the more Russia becomes aggressive in the areas where it can make pain to the West. And we see it that now Russia tries to take the void in Egypt. Russia tries to alliance with China, with other countries, with Iran. Iranian issue is not resolved. Yeah, that's all my comments, and I believe that there is a way to avoid the Cold War and to get a cooperative spirit of relation with Russia. Steve?
Let me reply to a few things that were said. From my point of view, and this has been my premise for a very long time, and certainly during this crisis, and I leave aside Europe, there can be no real American national security without Russia. Without Russia as an essential partner. End of story. For many of the reasons this gentleman just mentioned, we could add nuclear proliferation, we could add everything. Therefore, what's happening now is the destruction of American national security. I have been the target of most of the attacks in America for objecting to this policy and been called Putin's apologist. And my answer is no, I'm an apologist for American national security, and you people are wrecking it. And you can go to Afghanistan, you can go to nuclear weapons, you can go to the Middle East, so you're right. The problem of how you bring this reality to the attention of the world, and some of us have thought about that, including Dr. Roll, some kind of high-profile forum, we have to face the demographic reality. The people who could come from the past and tell us, stop, this is not what we had in mind, though I think Richard's absolutely right. After Malta, the United States was already beginning to plan on a world without Russia. In fact, Tom Graham, who became a national security advisor under Bush, wrote an article, A World Without Russia, just 2 years later. That didn't work out very well for them. But that generation, shaped by World War II, this is very important, has passed in America. Gorbachev is not well. He had to cancel a trip to the United States. Former President Bush, first President Bush, is confined to a wheelchair. He's not well. Reagan has passed. Henry Kissinger, who's with us in private, is 91 years old. The problem is that the generation that followed them was spoiled by a lot of the misunderstanding shaped by the events that my wife Katrina mentioned. There is a younger generation, well, everybody's younger than me, but there are younger people in America who have come forward, and interestingly enough, they're coming out of the conservative Reagan movement, who remember Ronald Reagan for 1985, 1989, as the man they think ended the Cold War, and believe that both parties have betrayed Reagan's legacy. But they have no influence in the United States now. Coming here for me is very important, very interesting. We Americans never see anything like the European Parliament. We have a 1.5 party system at most. The debates we have, if they have any substance, are so narrow, so bipartisan, that we don't hear the diversity of views that we hear in this room. There's another problem to which you refer. The narrative of World War II in America has been completely distorted. There has just been built in New Orleans the first American museum of the history of World War II, and its sponsors were the filmmakers Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. So if you've seen the film Saving Private Ryan, you know the American narrative. We had to come over to Europe in 1944 and get rid of Hitler for you. The Russian part of the war, the Eastern Front, where Hitler's war machine was destroyed. where Hitler's war machine was destroyed, doesn't figure in the American narrative. The reality of World War II is the Americans won the war in the Pacific and the Russians won the war in Europe, but that's been excluded. And I can tell you, as a person who taught 400 undergraduate Princeton students a year for 400 years, that when I would say that, they were shocked, unless Granddad had happened to fight in World War II, and he remembered it. You people have what Russians call živая historia. You still have it, living history. Not because we're a bad nation, but we're a provincial nation. We have a different attitude toward history. It started yesterday. So it is very hard to have this conversation, and then we don't have the multi-party, multinational kinds of political arenas that you have here. I want to make just two other points. What we have done, the United States in this crazy policy in Ukraine, in Russia, is what Russians call kick over tombstones. I mean, Odessa in Russia awakened memories that had gone to sleep. And when we kicked over those tombstones, Russians and Ukrainians remembered extermination squads. They remembered people being burned to death in buildings. Nothing was done, no investigation. Nothing, no investigation, nothing. But we don't have in America a sense of these historical demons. We just don't have them. Finally, I was going to say this to my colleague John Mersheimer, but others have mentioned it. If America pivots to Asia, and in fact, America is just going around in circles, it's not clear where it's going to end up. Let's say it pivots to Asia. Who will it encounter in Asia? Russia. Russia is in Asia already. It lives there. Half of Russia is in Asia. And there was already the view in Russia, before the Ukrainian crisis, that the future of Russia was not with the West. The West could not be trusted. They should pivot to Asia. Now, they are pivoting as fast as they can. For every market they're losing, every bank they're losing, every credit they're losing, and for every oil pipeline. The Bulgarian gentleman from Bulgaria didn't mention it, but they have open arms, maybe not as much money, maybe not quite as high technology. They have already pivoted to Asia. So if we pivot to Asia, and they've pivoted to Asia, here we'll be again, only now in Asia. So this really is, I think, and professors are always saying this, but I feel this from, we are at a turning point in history. We're at a fork in the road. And it looks like the bad road has been taken, but there might still be time to turn back. But I think now you folks in Europe have to do it. You're not going to find this leadership in America now. I mean, we do what we can do, but really we have to look to you all and to Europe. Is that good news or bad news? I don't know, because I don't know the situation in Europe.
So, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. My name is Liisa Jaakonsaari. I am from Finland, member of the European Parliament, and I don't believe that we can put history on ice. You said that we have to turn back, and some others said that the best situation is to achieve status quo. I don't believe that. We have to find solution from the future perspective. We are just in the European Parliament, in AFET committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, we are dealing with so-called INI report concerning the relations between the European Union and Russia. I think that's very important, and I would like to ask your advice from the American perspective and your expertise, that what would be those ideas that could in a constructive way show the way towards. It's in mind to find a kind of modern version of this Willy Brandt's, Egon Bahr's Neue Ostpolitik, where they really try to find common interests. And we have now in the world ISIS, terrorism, climate change, all this kind of common interest is how could we formulate this kind of challenges in a new policy. I read in 2 months ago, it was in Spiegel magazine interview from Mikhail Gorbachev, and it was interesting. He said that all the initiatives launched by Russia, European Union has said no, no. It's some kind of arrogance attitude from the European Union perspective, and I could see some leaders of the European Union who were so-called, as the Germans said, von oben. They always looked Russia von oben. And my question is really so that, do you see that, or it is naive to think that, for example, terrorism, climate change could make European Union and Russia closer, and USA as it is now? Thank you.
I'm Fraser Cameron, Director of the EU Russia Centre. Perhaps I give you an alternative view. But first, let me say I was actually present at the creation. I was actually a British diplomat during the 4+2 negotiations with Germany, and I was an EU official for much of the 1990s, dealing with Russia and with enlargement. So I was there, I actually saw what went on, and I can tell you there was no triumphalism, either in Brussels or in Washington. I can criticize the Americans as much as John or Stephen, but I must say for that Bush administration in 1991, they did a great job in dealing with the end of the Cold War, and the overwhelming feeling on both sides of the Atlantic was one of relief. Relief that it was over, relief that one could start doing other things on the European side, get on with the enlargement process. The Americans were sidetracked in Kuwait, remember, but there was no sense of triumphalism. What did we do? We actually brought Russia into the G8, into the Council of Europe, before they were ready for either. So this was hardly a sign of, the Europeans wanting to do down Russia. What we did get wrong, I think, was supporting Yeltsin in '96. Instead, we were frightened of Zhirinovsky and Zyuganov, backed Yeltsin wrongly, I think, in terms of the way we let the oligarchs get control. But again, this was not a sense of trying to defeat Russia or do down Russia. We can be criticized, I think, perhaps for ignoring Russia, but we didn't actually tell Russia, you must go and accept the advice of the Chicago boys. They actually wanted that advice themselves. So triumphalism is a red herring. Secondly, Richard spoke about the idea of a European security system, and this is supposed to be the title today. Well, we've actually got one. It's called the OSCE, of which Russia is a member, but we have not been able to make it work. And you ask yourself, why? And the answer is we have very different views about the principles on which European security should be based. And this was exposed very clearly by Angela Merkel when she said to Dmitry Medvedev, okay, you want this? Prove it. Let's see some action on Transnistria. Very small area where we can work together. Prove it. The Russians were unable to take any action. We didn't move forward. You have Russian troops in Moldova, in Georgia, Ukraine. So is that the kind of security we're talking about? So the fundamental question I have for John, Stephen, is quite simple. Do you actually think that in Europe we should have a security system based on the individual choice of citizens under a democracy? Or do you think it should simply be sphere of influence, and to hell with what the hell the majority of citizens think and want, whether it's in Ukraine or anyone else? Sphere of influence or democratic structures, I think, is the main question. And for Katrine, the media, you rightly criticize the American media. They've done a terrible job in many issues. I agree you can't have a decent debate on Russia or Israel or Iran. But what do you think about the state of the Russian media? Thank you.
I would just abuse my privilege as moderator to make one small remark that the triumphalism is not a subjective issue. At the if we wanted to take it a little bit later, in the unsuccessful re-election campaign of Bush Sr., he made this a point in his platform, that we had won the Cold War.
I am Daniel Stevens, Vice President of the Chamber of Commerce for Russia. In the reply to the first question, Mr. Mearsheimer told us that the US point of view is to be, in fact, the leader. And I share this opinion because I think that at the end of the USSR, the world who was bipolar, who was with two poles, became with only one pole, and it was well told at the fall of the buildings in New York when Bush told there are those who are with us and those who are against us. It's exactly the same as told the Imperator of Rome when he told there are the barbares and there are ourselves. And I think this is psychologically very important. And my question is, do you share my point of view that the United States, or at least many peoples in the United States, try to divide for better ruling the world. That means try to oppose the European Union to Russia. It is a short view game, of course, because as it was told, the world becomes multipolar, and Mr. Mearsheimer himself told that the next goals will be more for the US to the China, the Middle East. But still, I think that for the moment there are too many peoples in the United States who try to push even maybe towards the war, because they think that it would make stronger the United States if Europe, and especially European Union and Russia, becomes weaker. Mr. Cohen told us that the European Union should be more independent, but my question is, do the United States also could they make some efforts to change also in their psychology? Thank you.
My name is Yves Mollin-Labruyère. I'm working from the European External Action Service. And believe me, it's not so easy to speak about Russia, to speak about Ukraine today. And I'm tempted to begin my intervention with this reference. It's a question of seduction. Seduction. I didn't, but some of my colleagues organized recently a seminar with some participants coming from Russia and from Ukraine on conflict and culture. And some participants were coming from Donbass directly, but fortunately or unfortunately, they went through Kiev, where they lived for a couple of months. And quite surprisingly, they showed us some pictures of what were their first association activities in Donbass in favor of a free and democratic Ukraine. But we saw those people, those gentlemen, those ladies, very well dressed, blonde, apparently very prosperous. And they admitted that after a couple of months, they were sponsored by Western institutes, foundations, and so on. And they decided to move to Kiev. And where the war began, they understood that they have to come here and to present their own history to European citizens and so on. But the contrast between what they lived in the Donbass, the contrast between what they were hoping for their future in Donbass and what they live today, either in Brussels, in Washington, in London, and somewhere, is very, very troubling, because there is no possibility to oppose the phenomenon of seduction. We cannot ask the Russian, some very poor Russian or poor Ukrainian, to look at London, Paris, Washington, and prevent them to have the desire to live with us. The problem is that at a certain point, if you raise those sort of expectations, you give false hope to those people and to create perfect condition to war. When Victoria Nuland, for example, admitted openly
that the US spent I don't remember exactly the number, $5 billion to support democracy, human rights, and so on in Ukraine, we have to understand what it means. It means paying people to work on very Western-oriented institutions, foundations, and so on. And it is very, very, very powerful. And my question is very specific. I heard speaking about what Fraser said a couple of minutes ago. Could we prevent people to make individual choice? I think the choice we make individually is always related to the socio-economic condition in which we live. And putting the question of individual choice in the middle of the political game is very dangerous. Because as it has been said very, very often, for example, we always repeat, as it has been said just a couple of minutes ago, that we accepted the Russian in the G8, we accepted the Russian in the Council of Europe. But my God, what could have been a situation where we could have said no to the Russians? It is a clear legitimacy, but by contrast, as I see as a long-time analyst in the European institutions, the Russians put on the table twice a very serious and very structured project for new security architectures. Either Putin or the, quote, reformist Medvedev repeated the same projects. And as I was in those institutions at that time, believe me, I was in connection with my colleagues in Vienna, where the OSCE was in charge of discussing this project. The constant instruction was, let's discuss with them, in order to take time and to waste time, not waste time to convince that we are serious. But the reality is that we will never accept any form of treaty reorganizing the security architectures in Europe. We have exactly the same problem recently in Ukraine. The Russian demand in Ukraine was not so difficult, as it has been said. A federal Ukraine, yes. A neutral Ukraine. Absolutely. Is Sweden, is Finland, is Switzerland, is Austria so poor, so sad, so undemocratic? Yeah. I think that it is a very serious proposal. And I have difficulties to understand why we oppose that to such an extent that the Americans could send armaments to Ukraine in order to prevent such form of federalization and neutrality. And I will conclude with one short question. We heard speaking about what we call hybrid war by the Russians in Ukraine. Maybe it's true. There is a Russian military presence in Ukraine, but it doesn't bother me, because the alternative would be a complete invasion of Ukraine. I suppose all those people in this room has lived the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. An invasion is an invasion, with 250,000 troops, very visible. And my perception is how to manage this concept of hybrid war, not in contradiction with the Russians, but to, in one way, give them the argument that it is a sort of compromise, not to manage a real invasion of Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there were many questions, and I unfortunately can't deal with all of them. I wish I had an hour to talk. Let me just start with Fraser's, what I took to be his two main points. One was that the West was not triumphalist in the early years after the Cold War ended. I don't agree with you. I think that there's no question that the George H.W. Bush administration handled the end of the Cold War very smartly and did not, as we say in the United States, rub the Soviets' noses in the ground. And I think they did this in part because they wanted to make sure that the Cold War ended smoothly and quickly. And I think, as I said, given the circumstances, they did an excellent job. But the idea that there was no triumphalism in the United States belies common sense. We had just won a decisive victory over the Soviet Union. We were filled with the belief that this was due to the fact that we had a superior culture. The West had triumphed, and it was reflected in the Frank Fukuyama piece on the end of history. That resonated in the United States. It resonated more in the West. We had won, and the wind was at our back, and we believed that from then on out, the rest of the world was going to follow in our path. So I think we were triumphalists in a rather subtle way at the elite level. But nevertheless, I think we were triumphalists. And I think if you look at everything that happened after 1989, it fits in very neatly with that belief. Now, with regard to your point about the contrast regarding democracy on one hand and spheres of influence on the other, I think the way you said it reflects the way most Westerners think about Ukraine today and this general point. We love democracy in the West, and we promote it all the time. And spheres of influence, to put it in John Kerry's terminology, and I assume that you and John Kerry are on the same page here, think that this is a 19th century concept, that great powers don't worry about spheres of influence. They don't worry about security threats anymore. Well, that's just not the way the world works. The Russians care greatly about security. They care greatly about the balance of power in their neighborhood. And the Russians have made it clear since the mid-1990s that NATO expansion was unacceptable to them, and that if you were to march NATO up to their borders, this was going to cause all sorts of problems. I don't understand why the Americans and you don't understand that. Do you know we have this thing called the Monroe Doctrine? The Monroe Doctrine says that no distant great power is allowed into the Western Hemisphere. And if a distant great power comes into the Western Hemisphere, you surely remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States will go ballistic. There's no way the United States would ever tolerate, 20 or 30 years down the road, China forming a military alliance with Canada or Mexico. Why? The Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence, period. As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Why can't Putin have a sphere of influence? And when people like you tell the Ukrainians that they're a democratic state and they have sovereignty and they have the right to decide whatever they want to do in foreign policy, they can be pro-Western if they want, you're in effect leading them down the primrose path. Because we're not going to back them in the crunch. What's happening now is Ukraine is being destroyed. And Ukraine and Ukrainian leaders think they have the right? They're Democrats. They have the right to choose whichever side they want. Well, they don't have the right, any more than Cuba had the right in our eyes to invite the Soviet Union into the Western Hemisphere. Any more than Taiwan today has the right to declare its independence. Any more than Mexico and Canada would have the right 20 or 30 years down the road. It's just not the way the world works. And I think if you're not realistic about this, the end result, again, is you're going to lead Ukraine down the primrose path. And that's actually what happened.
I actually have a somewhat more benign view of what you said, in the sense that I think you raised the right questions. I mean, these are the questions that are being debated. My answer to you would be as emphatic as Professor Mersheimer's, because I see things with his help on this issue the way he does. The reality is, and I remember this moment because my wife and I were in Moscow, the first President Bush was a kind of a transitional figure in this triumphalist moment. He was torn both ways. And when the polls showed that he was losing to Clinton, he played the "we won the Cold War" role. And I think we were in Moscow at the time. And when Gorbachev heard this, he felt so betrayed that Bush would do this, and said to us, do you think Reagan feels that way? Because he always said that Bush and Reagan and Thatcher were his great partners, and Mitterrand and the rest, but he particularly focused on the Americans. So, you know, I agree with you, there was a turning point moment. But if you want to know, and I don't know how exposed you were to American political and mass opinion in the 90s, but if you want to know the reality of what Washington was thinking, all you have to do is read Stroke Talbot's memoirs. I suppose it's okay if I say use a word that you're not allowed to use in the American media. But Clinton said to Strobe, well, I guess we'll shovel some more shit down old Boris's throat. That was the policy, shoving shit down Boris's throat. What they told you Europeans and Brits, they may have conned you. I don't know. But this was the idea. Why they got this idea, I don't know. Now, you do make an important point, though, it seems to me, on the question about people, democracy, media. Let me formulate this. I don't know if John will agree with this or not. But to take his point to another level, NATO says that every country that qualifies, and the qualifications seem to be like an accordion, you can adjust it, has a right to join NATO. I don't think so. NATO is a security organization, not an American college fraternity. Not the Junior Chamber of Commerce in America, where everybody can join. NATO is a security organization, and the essential criterion of whether a country joins NATO or not is whether it increases or decreases our security. The expansion of NATO has gutted our national security, and it's gutted yours. And the attempt to bring Ukraine into that, and that's what this has all been about. It's been about this from the beginning, would lead to war with Russia. If your idea of security is war with nuclear Russia, then by all means bring Ukraine in right away. The warning sign was sent in 2008 in Georgia. Saakashvili was led to believe, as John said, that we would be there for him. And rightly we were not. So when we think about NATO, and I'm among these people who believe, though I know it's not going to happen in anybody's lifetime because it's the biggest welfare state in the world, NATO is not going to be abolished. But the understanding of membership, if it's a security organization, has to be whether it's a plus or minus for security. And we've had 15 years of learning that expanding NATO toward Russia is a minus in terms of everybody's security. We are in the worst international security crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's about NATO, so it's time to draw those conclusions. One last point about the Russian media. Katrina and I lived among Soviet dissidents in the 1970s and 80s. We had our visas taken away by the Soviet authorities because we were too busy with Soviet dissidents, bringing manuscripts in and out. But we do believe that we have to pay attention to the voices in Russia. But it's not our job to help them win their political battles. Russians didn't come and help American black folk get full rights. They didn't come and help American gays get their rights. We Americans do it ourselves, and Russians have to do it themselves. And I'll give you one last perverse, depressing piece of news. I read the Russian, I don't watch much TV, but I read the Russian print media across the spectrum. From Novaya Gazeta to Sovietskaya Russia and Zavtra, from the left to the right. There is more criticism of Putin's Ukrainian policy in Russia than there is in the American press of American policy. That makes me very, very unhappy, not because of Russia, but because of us.
I want to just make 2 points, picking up on the important words of Richard Sakwa and the MEP from Finland. You know, part of what we try and do at the nation is lift up alternatives. And to hear Richard Sakwa remind us of the genuine vision of continentalism that Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev laid out decades ago reminds of missed opportunities. They're not lost opportunities, and I think we now have a generation or two which has not heard the ideas, which link to your thoughts about how do we build common ground around issues. We build common ground by beginning to lay out what a new security architecture would be. Until people see something, they won't come to it. They see now failure. They see discredited security architecture. I think the Eurozone crisis may also force things. No one has mentioned Syriza or even Podemos, which may win in Spain in the next elections. The leader of Podemos was in New York recently and was asked about the relationship with Russia, and he said, I have no use for Putin, but Europe needs a good relationship with Russia. There's an understanding there. So I think the idea of lifting up what were opportunities is important for a new generation confronting climate, confronting ISIS. On the media question, I think, Mr. Cameron, if you listen to my remarks, I concluded by my belief in dissenting voices and freedom of speech, and having been involved with some of the opposition newspapers which still exist in Moscow, writing about those, the nation committed to freedom of speech, I don't think one needs to distinguish between criticizing the US media, for which we want to uphold in the spirit of the best American values, and understand that in Russia right now the media is under terrible stress, and if the Cold War we are witnessing unfolds in even more brutal directions, that space for freedom of speech becomes ever more narrow.
Well, in closing this meeting, I'd like to thank our panelists for very substantive and very intellectually stimulating presentations, and I'd like to thank our audience for enriching this discussion.